Thank you very much indeed for staying with us on Newsnight. On Friday, the President submitted the last set of list of ministers for approval by the Senate. The list was submitted 67 days after his inauguration as President. The recent alteration 23 to the Constitution, requires the President to submit his ministerial list within 60 days of taking the oath of office. The President was sworn in on May 29, 2023 and submitted the last of his ministerial list on August 4, 2023, 7 days before more than the prescribed 60 days after taking the oath of office. What's the implication of this breach of the Constitution? How should the National Assembly respond to this breach? What does this breach tell us about the character of the new government? Yes, we have Dr. Sam Amadi, a rights analyst, with us here in the studio to look at these issues. Thank you, Dr. Sam, for coming on Newsnight.
Thank you.
The constitutionality of the ministerial list is another slant to the ever-pressing issue of ministerial appointments in Nigeria, talking about the current regime. Speak to us about the breach of this constitutionality.
First, we never had to debate about constitutionality of ministerial appointments before nominations. We always talk about whether the quality of nominees, which is a matter of opinion. People can differ on the competence of different persons. So, and it's the president's prerogative to appoint people to that office. So that's been a debate also. But for the first time, people are not looking at the constitution. Again, the alteration happened towards it, to a light of President Buhari's tenure. The National Assembly, part of the recent alterations that included the change in the power of states to generate electricity. One of those items, alteration 5, which is called number 23. If they can flash alteration 5 number 23 on the screen, so we can see it, talks about mandatory provision that the president or the governor must submit their ministers and commissioners list not more than 60 days before, after they were sworn in. Now, the history of that is because we saw a long period of time it took President Buhari at a point to appoint ministers. And many people of the opinion that if you delay so much in appointing ministers, it affects that's the alteration 5, number 23. So it specifically says it must be within 60 days. Now, the problem is, nobody expects, and probably the Tinubu's minders lost sight of this new, because I remember it was just fresh. 2 months, I think it was around March 27th or so, that it was signed to law, and the government came into power May 29. So maybe they never thought about this. But somehow the president submitted the first list just at the dead of time. You know, he made it. The first list made it. Now the second list didn't make it. There are 3 arguments that could arise. One of them is when the constitution says you must submit your ministerial list before timeout, which is 60 days. Does it mean that the first entry of that ministerial list, then the subsequent ministerial lists are amendments? In which case you can say, lawyers can argue, that the first entry, you have submitted it, but you not come back. But when you submit list 1, and you're not amending, you are adding other people who are not on that first list, then these are fresh submissions. So 2 clear arguments will be that the first one goes in, missed the time, the constitutional time. The subsequent list breaches the constitutional timing. Okay, now, key point is that that section did not provide for penalty. It didn't say a president who fails to submit those lists will be impeached or will suffer any. Of course, constitutional texts don't necessarily imply prohibition. For example, when they say that government, state governors should not legislate on this matter, it didn't say that the state governor that breaches that section and legislate on a matter exclusive to the federal, they're not going to impeach the governor. They won't cut off the head. So those constitutional provisions, even though they don't have sanctions, are mandatory. Now, if somebody goes to the court to challenge the subsequent appointment of these other ministers, if they are confirmed, the appointment arguably is unconstitutional.
Okay, so how does the National Assembly, the Senate, now respond to this breach?
Okay, two things can happen. First, it's even doubtful if the leadership of the Senate has paid attention to this amendment. And this is a big problem that's Nigeria. We only allow courts to decide on constitutional issues. But constitutions are actually not for adjudication. They're actually for constitutional living, meaning administrative agencies, individuals must know the Constitution. But we look at Constitution as what happens when courts arbitrate on them. But no, Constitution should guide all our performance. So it's doubtful whether the leadership knew. If they knew, what they do two things. First is that they can confirm the first list. The second list, they cannot confirm it. They have to wait to amend that section because of political expediency.
I was coming there because because the point you made earlier before I asked the last question was that if anything happens in future and someone goes to court to challenge the appointment of those ministers sent in later, whose names were sent in later, that the person might win as on the grounds that
the unconstitutional appointment,
it was an unconstitutional appointment.
By the experts,
so then would the Senate now confirm unconstitutional appointments?
The Senate,
or nominations,
is equivalent of Senate acting against the Constitution. For example, when the Senate makes a law or National Assembly against the Constitution, they have made a law. But once it is pronounced unconstitutional, it becomes null and void. Now, if the Senate confirms an appointment made outside constitutional timeline, that appointment is ipso facto, as lawyers will say, by that fact alone, unconstitutional. Because the Constitution says you must nominate within 60 days. If you nominate outside 60 days, it's unconstitutional nomination.
Okay, what about, what if the president waits till about maybe sometime in January next year and then says, okay, I want to create new ministries and then I want new ministers?
Then you see, the president has already appointed his ministers. He's now substituting them. And again, that's a good question. It means that by the time you submit that list, you can't appoint new ministers as additional ministers. You can appoint substitution, which is a minister exists, but you are substituting. Two different things. Again, good point. You see, the point about in many countries of the world, there are no constitutional regulation around appointment of ministers. For example, nobody says it must come from each states. Why would the president leave out a state in Nigeria and appoint only 35 states, not 36? Because the Constitution says he must provide one person. So Nigerians don't understand that the nature of a governance is constitutionally defined and different. What the US may be applicable abroad, US may not be applicable in Nigeria. And oftentimes we see massive constitutional breach because those in power don't first understand the Constitution. And that the Constitution is the definition of governance. By the way, the president has Section 5 power. The appointment of officers, everybody, flows from Section 5. The same Section 5 says that the president's executive power is conditioned on what the Constitution says and what National Assembly says.
Okay, good. Now, let me button just again. What if after a year, still, I'm just extending my last question, the frontiers. Now, what if after like a year or two, the president now decides to change his entire cabinet? And says, okay, I want new fresh ministers.
It's still a substitution. Because, I mean, you can substitute one or all. The critical question that the Constitution set out is that a president must exercise that executive discretion to appoint ministers. Is part discretion, who you appoint. It's part constitutional that it must be at least one for each state. And in addition, this new alteration says, in addition to instituting, because it comes from Section 147, 1, 2, 3. The first one says you have to appoint ministers. Second one talks about you have to appoint from each state. The third one now says, this alteration now says, when you appoint, you must submit it within 60 days of your inauguration. So what that means is that the president is now forced to make that choice. But once he has made that choice, he can make multiple substitutions because they are built on the original
choice.
list.
Now, Dr. Amadi, Dr. Amadi, so what does this now say of the new administration?
Two things. We're not seeing, and maybe it happens to many other administrations, we're not seeing due diligence on constitutional issues. Before you set up a government, you do due diligence. Because constitutions are being changed, and again, it says something about they will change the constitution. Not too much public discourse. Abroad, all over the world, constitutional changes are major events that they happen rarely. Maybe one, if you look at that slate of alterations, there are more than 10 or 20. Too many. So it's possible that a well-meaning president and his team can miss out on the implication of too many things. Laundry list. We should be amending our constitution. I've argued before that our constitution should be amended one by one. You just take one and exhaust that process, as Section 9 says. So again, what it means again is that we're not running the risk of having a government that can be described as unconstitutional. Now, what's the remedy? I think we should focus on the remedy. The National Assembly has to confirm the first set that got in on time. They should go back and amend the Constitution. It can take them 2-3 days fast track. Amend that section to now expand the scope to maybe 70 days, whatever it is, to accommodate the president. Because, by the way, to double jeopardy, if you don't approve the subsequent lists, you've also contravened the constitution that says each state must have, because 11 states we are missing on day one submission. So you can't leave those states without representation in the cabinet. So this is just double whammy. Head you lose, tail you lose.
Catch 22.
So the only answer then is approve that 11. Amend the amendment to the Constitution. And that's why we should stop amending constitutions to respond to political exigencies. The fact that the president did not appoint a minister in 60 days or 100 days shouldn't be a reason to put a constitutional requirement. I've always argued, and I've fallen out with senators, stop amending constitution to respond to political failures arising from leadership failure. President Buhari didn't appoint on time. What the heck? It doesn't matter. Don't change the constitution. Don't put in the constitution. Now you've put in the constitution, and the new president didn't see it, or nobody paid attention because it's an alteration. If you take a typical constitution, you won't see it. But by virtue of amendment, it is now read into the constitution. So today, if Senate approves the second, third list, they have breached the constitution, and those appointments are all constitutional. So 2 lessons: stop amending constitution like as if it's a laundry list. 1, 2, 3, 4 amended. Nobody pays attention except people like us who are probably because we are Abuja school, we are scholars. So we keep looking. But you don't expect politicians to be reading all these alterations all the time. They don't know the implication. 2, now that we are stuck, because if you go ahead, you are going to have an unconstitutional governance. If you don't go ahead, you're going to have unconstitutional governance because 11 states will not have cabinet representation. The only answer is approve the first slate of ministers, quickly amend the constitution to allow Mr. President. In fact, amend to delete that provision so that President will have full plate of his ministers because he has a right to have the people he wants as ministers. But then he's not caught in a horn of dilemma because the constitution has circumscribed that right to say it has to happen in 60 days. Out of 60 days, unconstitutional. You don't want to be a president who, even if you're effective, doing well, even if you are popular, everybody loves you, you don't want to have your government stamped with unconstitutionality. Somebody can go to court, and the judge is caught. Once the constitution, the judge has no discretion.
That would be like what a called error of original entry.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
That's the point. That's the point.
Yeah. All right, analyst, for your insight on the constitutionality of the president's ministerial list on Newsnight. Thank you very much indeed.